February 12, 1997, Bessbrook, County Armagh. A 23-year-old lance bombardier from the Royal Horse Artillery is standing at a permanent vehicle checkpoint near the edge of town. His name is Stephen Restorick. A woman named Lorraine McElroy has just pulled up. She and her husband are heading home, ice cream for their children on the back seat. Restorick checks her driving licence. He hands it back. He smiles. McElroy described what happened next 2 days later, speaking to the Los Angeles Times. He checked my licence, handed it back to me, and smiled and thanked me. And just straight away there was a crack and a flash. A single .50 caliber round struck Restorick in the back. It went through his flak jacket clean. He died from his wounds that afternoon. Stephen Restorick was 23 years old. He was, as the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland later confirmed, the last serving soldier killed by the IRA in Northern Ireland. Not the last of a difficult winter, not the last of a bad year, the last. No British soldier would die at the hands of the Provisional IRA between that February checkpoint and the Good Friday Agreement 14 months later. For years after his death, press coverage named the wrong man as the person who fired that shot. When the man most commonly blamed died in Monaghan Town in December 2013, mainstream outlets across Ireland described him as the sniper, the triggerman, the man who shot Restorick. That attribution was wrong. The military had known it was wrong since the evening of April 10, 1997, when a unit of SAS soldiers drove a van at speed into a farm complex near Crossmaglen and arrested a man named Michael Caraher. This is the story of what actually happened. South Armagh sits in the southern corner of County Armagh, approximately 192 square miles of drumlin country, rough grazing land, and narrow rural roads that push hard against the border with the Republic of Ireland. Merlin Rees, the Northern Ireland Secretary, stood in the House of Commons in January 1976 and called it Bandit Country. He meant it as a warning. Republicans in South Armagh heard it as a fair description. A Time magazine correspondent visited Armagh in January 1976 and filed a report that reads almost like a military assessment. British law begins somewhere above treetop level, he wrote. Road travel by the 550 British troops in the area is so risky that it has been abandoned. The army either moves about by chopper or does not move at all. That was 1976. The picture barely improved over the following 2 decades. The Provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade had, between 1970 and 1997, killed at least 123 British soldiers and 42 Royal Ulster Constabulary officers. In a 10-mile radius around the geographic centre of the region, the RUC recorded 1,255 bombings and 1,158 shootings over that same period. These weren't isolated incidents produced by small, disorganised cells. They were the sustained output of a brigade that had retained its full battalion structure, unique in the PIRA, precisely because the closeness of the community and its republican character made infiltration genuinely difficult. The security forces recorded fewer arrests relative to operational activity in South Armagh than in any other IRA brigade area in Northern Ireland. By the early 1970s, the British Army had effectively conceded the roads. A Saracen armoured vehicle was destroyed by a culvert bomb near Crossmaglen in October 1975, and from that point, the army transitioned almost entirely to helicopter movement. Bessbrook Mill, a converted Victorian linen factory on the edge of Bessbrook town, became the British Army's main base in South Armagh, and at the height of the conflict, the busiest helipad in Europe. Soldiers were flown into Crossmaglen barracks by Chinook helicopter. Supplies, mail and waste went by air. To drive the roads of South Armagh as a British soldier was to accept the risk of a culvert bomb, an ambush, or, by 1990, a .50 caliber round from a position the patrol never saw. The South Armagh Brigade wasn't a gaggle of volunteers who occasionally became operational. Its most effective members were, by any reasonable military assessment, full-time irregular soldiers in terrain they knew as intimately as the fields they had farmed since childhood. The IRA's 1979 Warren Point ambush, which killed 18 soldiers in a single afternoon, was a South Armagh Brigade operation. The shooting down of 5 British Army helicopters over the course of the Troubles was mostly South Armagh Brigade work. The brigade carried out 23 attacks on British helicopters in total, bringing 5 down on separate occasions. Into this environment, in 1990, someone introduced a Barrett .50 caliber anti-materiel rifle. The Barrett wasn't an improvised weapon, and the IRA didn't stumble into acquiring one. It was an American-manufactured precision rifle designed to defeat light armor, vehicles and equipment at ranges up to 1,800 meters. The South Armagh Brigade's procurement of the weapon involved transatlantic gun-running networks that had been operating since the mid-1980s. One M82 had been shipped in pieces from Chicago to Dublin in August 1986, where it was reassembled. 2 M90 models were purchased in January 1995, 6 months after the first IRA ceasefire began, from a firearms dealer in Cleveland, Ohio, by a Cuban-American contact named Michael Caraher, who passed them to an Irishman who shipped them, along with ammunition and telescopic sights, to the Republic. The weapon's advantage was stark and practical. Standard British Army body armour in the 1990s could absorb 7.62mm rounds at combat distances. It offered no meaningful protection against 50 BMG. One unidentified senior figure in the IRA's sniper campaign described it to journalist Toby Harnden in terms that were blunt and precise. What's special about the Barrett is the huge kinetic energy. The bullet can just walk through a flak jacket. South Armagh was the prime place to use such a weapon because of the availability of Brits. They came to dread it, and that was part of its effectiveness. Dread isn't too strong a word. The British Ministry of Defence eventually issued new body armour specifically in response to the sniper threat. It cost £4,000 per set and weighed 14.5 kilograms, too heavy for sustained patrol use. By the MOD's own formal assessment of Operation Banner, the sniper campaign had an impact on morale among some troops and police officers. A British Army major, quoted in the same assessment period, put it more honestly. Some servicemen had to be disciplined for remaining in shelter while under orders to check vehicles. The morale of troops at static positions had deteriorated to the point where, as he said, the IRA had succeeded in forcing troops off the ground. The sniper at work signs the IRA erected along South Armagh's roads weren't theatrical. They were factual, and soldiers knew it. The campaign began on March 16, 1990, when a Barrett M82 was used for the first time in the conflict, a round that pierced the helmet of a light infantry lance corporal on Castle Blaney Road, who survived with minor head injuries. The first killing came on August 28, 1992. Private Paul Turner, shot in the chest in the main square of Crossmaglen, 250 yards from the barrel. Between that August morning and February 1997, the sniper teams killed 7 British soldiers and 2 RUC officers. The campaign ran across 7 distinct engagements: Crossmaglen, Fork Hill, Newtown Hamilton, Newry, Keady, and the pattern was consistent: a single shot, a fatal wound, silence. The last of those engagements, before a 6-month operational pause forced by the 1994 ceasefire, came on December 30th, 1993. Guardsman Daniel Blinko, 22 years old, shot dead by a sniper while passing Murtagh's pub in Crossmaglen. The date was the 3rd anniversary of the shooting that killed Michael Caraher and severely wounded his brother Michael. That coincidence wasn't noted in the British press. In South Armagh, it was understood. The vehicle that made the campaign nearly impossible to counter was a Mazda 626 that had been physically adapted for sniping. A purpose-built shooting port was cut into the boot of the car. The Barrett was positioned inside the boot, aimed through that port. An armour plate was fitted to protect the shooter if security forces returned fire. Supporting vehicles travelled ahead of the shooting car to alert the team to checkpoint locations along the road network. The sniper lay in the boot. The trigger was pulled. The boot closed. The car drove. In operational terms, this was elegant and brutal. There was no static firing position to triangulate, no skyline to silhouette against, no hide to find afterward. By the time the crack of a .50 caliber round registered with soldiers at a checkpoint, by the time anyone oriented to the direction of the shot identified a potential target, raised a weapon, the Mazda was already moving. On roads the team had used for years, across a border they could be across in minutes. A vehicle with a 30-second head start effectively didn't exist. The Wikipedia article on the South Armagh sniper campaign, drawing on Harnden's research, confirms that the marksman usually fired from a distance of less than 300 metres, despite the weapon's effective range of around 1 kilometre. Close enough to guarantee the shot, far enough to guarantee the exit. In at least one incident, after the killing of a soldier in Fork Hill on March 17, 1993, British soldiers returned fire at the sniper's vehicle without effect. What conventional response was available against this? Infantry squads at checkpoints couldn't pursue a car that was gone before they processed the event. Helicopter response was theoretically available, but practically slow. And by the time a Lynx was airborne, the car was in a barn somewhere south of the border. The SAS, already present in Northern Ireland, attempted a direct counter. They established ambushes using decoy infantry patrols to draw out the sniper team. It failed twice. South Armagh wasn't terrain where you could configure a kill zone without someone in the community spotting the unusual pattern. The solution, when it came, wasn't about firepower or aggression. It was about patience. Before describing how the SAS finally closed the net, it's necessary to establish exactly who they were hunting. This is where the public record went badly wrong, where it remains wrong in popular coverage, and where the correction matters not just for historical accuracy, but for understanding what the operation actually achieved. When Bernard McGinn was found dead at his home in Monaghan Town on December 21, 2013, RTE described him as a former IRA sniper convicted of killing the last British soldier to die before the Good Friday Peace Agreement. The Irish Examiner ran virtually the same line. Irish Central called him the infamous IRA sniper who shot Lance Bombardier Stephen Restorick dead in Bessbrook in February 1997. These descriptions were wrong on a foundational level. Understanding why requires understanding who Bernard McGinn actually was and who he wasn't. McGinn was born around 1957 in Castle Blaney, County Monaghan. His father was a local Sinn Féin councillor. His brother-in-law, Cuiv Geen O'Quillane, would eventually serve as a Sinn Féin TD in the Dáil. His IRA career was rooted in explosives from its beginning. In 1978, he and Desi O'Hare killed a former Ulster Defence Regiment soldier named Thomas Johnston in Keady. In 1979, he was arrested at a disused farmhouse on charges of explosives possession, failed to appear at trial, and was eventually captured only after a 27-hour siege in Dundalk, in which he held a family hostage with a pistol and a hand grenade. He served until 1987. Released from prison, he rejoined the South Armagh Brigade and became a trusted explosives specialist. He helped assemble the bombs used at the Baltic Exchange in London in April 1992. He was involved in the construction and deployment of the Docklands bomb in February 1996, the explosion that killed 2 people, injured 100 more, and ended the first IRA ceasefire. He had a hand in the Hammersmith Bridge bombing the same year. McGinn described his explosives work during interrogation at Gough Barracks after his April 1997 arrest with the conversational matter-of-factness of a man describing a trade. He manufactured explosive mixes north and south of the border on an almost daily basis. Making bombs, he told his interrogators, was like a day's work. McGinn was also a member of the South Armagh sniper team. He was there for the operations. But Toby Harnden, in Bandit Country, the most comprehensive investigative account of the South Armagh Brigade published to date, describes McGinn and Seamus McArdle as key members of the backup team used to get Caraher in place and protect him. The function of that backup team was logistical and protective, getting the shooter positioned, providing the scout vehicles, covering the withdrawal. The function was essential. The barrel was someone else's. When McGinn's trial concluded at Belfast Crown Court on March 19, 1999, he was convicted of 34 separate offences and sentenced to 490 years, including 3 life sentences for the murders of Restorick, Lance Bombardier Paul Garrett, and Thomas Johnston. It was those murder convictions, prominently reported in 1999, that locked McGinn the sniper into public consciousness. What received less coverage was October 2000, when the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal ruled that McGinn had not been properly cautioned before making his confessions at Gough Barracks. The murder and explosives convictions, built primarily on that confession, were quashed. What survived were convictions for conspiracy to murder and firearms possession, a 20-year sentence. He had already been released under the Good Friday Agreement by the time the appeal was decided. The confusion, then, was built from a sequence of legal events the press never fully tracked. McGinn was convicted of the murder, prominently, in 1999. His conviction was quashed, quietly, in 2000. The 1999 headline, "McGinn convicted of killing Restorick," was never effectively corrected in popular coverage. And so, when McGinn died in 2013, the original framing reasserted itself, unchallenged. So where does the attribution to Caraher come from? 2 sources, more specific than the surviving conviction record. The first is contemporaneous Irish Times court reporting from the 1999 trial. During proceedings, the court was told that McGinn had named one of his co-accused as the actual sniper. The co-accused was Caraher. The second source is Harnden's Bandit Country, which identifies Michael Caraher as an IRA sniper responsible for the deaths of up to 8 soldiers, and places McGinn and McArdle as the support element that got Caraher into position. Harnden spent years on this book, interviewing sources inside both the IRA and the British security forces. His identification of Caraher as the principal shooter isn't rumour. It's the product of detailed investigative journalism cross-referenced against court testimony. The formal legal record, after the appeal, does not contain a surviving murder conviction naming either man as the specific gunman. What it contains are the firearms possession convictions, all 4 men convicted of possessing the Barrett, and the investigative record pointing to Caraher as the triggerman. That is the honest position on the evidence, and it's considerably more specific and durable than the McGinn attribution that dominated coverage for 20 years. Michael Caraher was 31 years old at sentencing in March 1999. He grew up in Cullyhanna, South Armagh, from a Republican family. Harnden notes he had already acted as a lookout during a failed IRA attack before the sniper campaign began. He wasn't an accidental recruit. To understand how he arrived at that farm near Freeduff in April 1997, you have to go back to December 30th, 1990. That evening, Caraher's brother Fergal, a Sinn Féin member and IRA volunteer, 20 years old, was killed by Royal Marines at a checkpoint near Cullyhanna. Michael was in the same car. He was severely wounded in the incident and lost a lung. He survived. He gave an interview to ITN News after his brother's death. The footage exists. A young man from South Armagh speaking into a camera about what the Royal Marines did. 2 Royal Marines from 45 Commando, Lance Corporal Richard Elkington and Private Andrew Callaghan, were eventually tried for murder and acquitted. Michael Caraher would have watched that verdict. The Wikipedia article on Fergal Caraher states flatly, his brother, Michael Caraher, who was severely wounded in the shooting, later became the shooter of one of the South Armagh sniper squads, which killed 7 British soldiers and 2 Royal Ulster Constabulary members. There is a direct line between those 2 events that the academic literature on PIRA recognises, even when the press does not draw it explicitly. The Troubles had an organic and terrible recruitment logic in South Armagh. A shooting that killed your brother and destroyed one of your lungs, followed by the acquittal of the men responsible. That trajectory, in that community, in that decade, wasn't unusual. The guardsman Daniel Blinko was shot dead in Crossmaglen on December 30th, 1993, the 3rd anniversary of Fergal Caraher's death. Whether deliberate or coincidental, the date was noted. Caraher's operational address was the Kiltybane Road in Cullyhanna. His cell, the Western Team, operating in the area around Cullyhanna, was responsible for several of the 9 killings attributed to the South Armagh sniper campaign. The Eastern Cell, based around Dromintee, was a separate unit operating on the other side of South Armagh. It was never caught. The Dromintee squad remains unapprehended. By 1996, the sniper campaign had run for 6 years. The IRA had killed 7 soldiers and 2 RUC officers with high-powered rifle fire from concealed and mobile positions. Conventional infantry responses had failed. Reactive helicopter response had failed. SAS decoy patrol ambushes had failed twice. The first IRA ceasefire, which ran from August 1994 to February 1996, had given the security forces an operational breathing space. The RUC could operate more openly in South Armagh during that period, without the constant threat of being shot, and the intelligence picture developed accordingly. Captain Rupert Thorneloe of the Welsh Guards, who served as an intelligence liaison officer between the 3rd Infantry Brigade and the RUC Special Branch, worked during this period to build the targeting case against the sniper team. Thorneloe was later killed in Afghanistan in July 2009 by an IED while commanding his regiment. He reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Harnden identifies him as one of the key figures in the British effort against the sniper squads. When the Docklands bomb ended the ceasefire in February 1996, the security forces had a more developed intelligence picture than they had possessed before the truce. MI5 had, that same year, launched a concentrated operation against the South Armagh Brigade, designated Airlines. The operation's specifics remain classified, but its existence confirms that by 1996, British intelligence at the highest operational level was treating the South Armagh sniper team as a priority target, rather than a recurring tactical problem for local infantry. The unit tasked with the surveillance phase was 14 Intelligence Company, known within the intelligence community as the DET. Created in the early 1970s with SAS involvement, 14 INT existed specifically to conduct covert technical and human surveillance operations in Northern Ireland. Their remit was intelligence development, identifying the target, understanding the pattern, building a picture accurate enough to justify and successfully execute a hard stop. The SAS served as the intervention force when 14 INT delivered the opportunity. In South Armagh, conventional physical surveillance was close to unusable. The community was the IRA's early warning system. A face that didn't belong to the landscape was noted and reported before the person attached to it could establish a position. 14 INT compensated through technical means. Hidden cameras were installed near locations associated with the cell's movements, concealed inside objects that attracted no attention in a rural South Armagh environment. An electronic tracking device was placed on the Mazda 626. That tracking device was critical. 14 Intelligence Company detected the Mazda stationary and within range at the time of the February 1997 shooting at Bessbrook, the operation that killed Restorick. That confirmed what investigators suspected: the car's operational role, the team's pattern, and the farm complex near Friduff as the central node of the cell's activity. The pattern of life surveillance ran for weeks. Each piece was laid down without triggering the community intelligence network that had burned 2 previous SAS counter-sniper operations. The surveillance wasn't comfortable work. South Armagh in the early spring of 1997 was cold, exposed, and entirely hostile ground for anyone operating covertly. Static observation positions in Drumlin country, on the edges of Republican communities where the IRA's own surveillance extended to every unfamiliar car and face. This was the environment in which 14 INT had to work quietly enough not to exist. Former operators who have spoken in general terms about covert work in South Armagh describe it as technically demanding and physically grinding in equal measure. Long periods of absolute stillness in difficult conditions, with the knowledge that a single compromise could end the operation and, potentially, the operator. The IRA's counter-surveillance capability was embedded in the landscape and the culture. Defeating it required operating at a different tempo, not faster, but more patient, more technical, and willing to wait for certainty before moving. The certainty came on April 10th, 1997. The farm complex near Friduff, a small townland close to Crossmaglen, South Armagh. Surveillance assets were tracking 4 men: Michael Caraher, Bernard McGinn, Seamus McArdle, and Martin Mines. All 4 were members of the Western Sniper Cell. The intelligence read showed them preparing the Mazda. The assessment was that the team was readying for another operation. The decision was made not to wait for the next shot. 16 undercover SAS soldiers drove into the farm complex in a van. The British troops were operating under strict orders to avoid IRA casualties. After a brief scuffle, all 4 men were seized at gunpoint. They were handed to the RUC. No shots were fired. The most dangerous sniper team the IRA had fielded in South Armagh, a team that had evaded every conventional British military response for 7 years, was in handcuffs on a farm in Crossmaglen. Searching the farm, soldiers found the Barrett .50 caliber rifle hidden in the roof of a horsebox. Along with it, the ammunition. The weapon was seized and would become the central physical exhibit in the subsequent Belfast Crown Court proceedings. All 4 men were taken to Gough Barracks in Armagh. McGinn was interrogated for a week. He confessed. He implicated more than 20 members of the South Armagh Brigade in attacks in Northern Ireland and England. He walked interrogators through his bomb-making activities across more than a decade of IRA mainland operations. He described the work's scale and frequency with the detachment of a professional. He also, as the Irish Times reported from inside the 1999 trial, named one of his co-accused as the actual sniper. RUC forensics took fingerprints from Caraher and the other arrested men. Gloves found near Caraher at the time of arrest were later confirmed by forensic analysis to have been present in the barn and on Caraher himself. The physical evidence tied him directly to the sniper team's operational infrastructure. Seamus McArdle, who had connections to the Canary Wharf bombing, was convicted at Woolwich Crown Court in October 1998 of conspiring to cause an explosion and sentenced to 25 years. His case was processed separately from the Belfast proceedings. The Belfast Crown Court sentencing came on March 19, 1999. McGinn received 490 years for 34 separate offences, 3 life sentences for the murders of Restorick, Lance Bombardier Paul Garrett and Thomas Johnston, alongside the major bombing convictions: Baltic Exchange 1992, Docklands 1996, Hammersmith Bridge 1996. He laughed at the sentence in court. Everyone in that courtroom understood why. Under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, signed the previous April, he would be free within months. He walked out of HM Prison Maze in July 2000, having served 16 months. Michael Caraher received 105 years. His convictions: possession of rifles and ammunition with intent to endanger life, possession of property in connection with the sniper attacks, conspiracy and associated possession charges, reflected what the court could prove from the physical evidence. He wasn't convicted of murder. That distinction matters for legal accuracy, but it does not obscure what the investigative record, court testimony, and forensic evidence established about his role. He was released in 2001 under the GFA prisoner provisions. Martin Mines was convicted alongside McGinn and McArdle of 6 killings, 2 of which had no connection to the South Armagh sniping operations. They arose from the Canary Wharf bombing. Then, in October 2000, the Court of Appeal intervened. McGinn's murder and explosives convictions were quashed because he had not been properly cautioned before his confessions at Gough Barracks. What survived were conspiracy to murder and firearms possession. He was already free. The formal legal record was revised. The press coverage wasn't. There is one dimension of how these men were processed that is worth addressing directly. The Provisional IRA spent much of the 1970s and 1980s demanding prisoner of war status for its captured volunteers. The 1981 hunger strike, in which 10 men died in the maze, was fought over exactly that question: political status, combatant recognition, POW rights. Raymond McCreish, one of the 10 who died, was a South Armagh man. The demand, articulated by the IRA's Army Council and repeated by Sinn Féin at every level, was that PIRA volunteers were soldiers of the Irish Republic fighting a legitimate war, not criminals to be processed by British courts. McGinn sat in court in March 1999 and laughed at his 490-year sentence. His defence team invoked every protection available under criminal law at every stage of his case, including, successfully on appeal, the requirement that a suspect be properly cautioned before confession. The appeal that freed him from the murder convictions rested not on any principle of combatant immunity, not on the laws of armed conflict, but on the procedural requirements of Northern Irish criminal law. The organisation that claimed its volunteers were soldiers of the Irish Republic availed itself of civilian criminal law protections when those protections were convenient. The distinction isn't a minor legalistic point. It was a consistent feature of how PIRA navigated the legal system. Prisoner of war status for the cells, criminal procedure protections for the individuals. McGinn walked out of the maze in July 2000 under the terms of an agreement that treated him not as a surrendered enemy combatant, but as a released prisoner within a peace process. The two positions were never reconciled, because reconciling them was never the point. Stephen Restorick's mother, Rita, channeled the devastation of February 1997 into something constructive. She became a peace campaigner, meeting with politicians, writing letters to President Clinton, travelling to Northern Ireland. She published a memoir, Death of a Soldier, A Mother's Search for Peace in Northern Ireland, through Blackstaff Press in 2000. Shortly after Stephen's death, while staying with family in Shropshire, she had flowers sent to Lorraine McElroy in Bessbrook. The card read, "Stephen is now back in Peterborough. Thank you for being there for him when we couldn't." McElroy, slightly injured by shrapnel in the attack, had been the last person to speak to him. Caraher's solicitor throughout the case was Rosemary Nelson, a prominent human rights lawyer from Lurgan who had represented a number of prominent Republican clients and had reported receiving death threats from loyalist paramilitaries. She was killed on March 15, 1999, 4 days before the Belfast Crown Court sentencing hearing where Caraher received his 105-year term. A bomb placed beneath her car by the loyalist Red Hand defenders. Bernard McGinn lived out his post-prison years in Monaghan Town. He was found dead at his home on December 21, 2013, aged 55 or 56, suspected heart attack. The obituaries described him as the man who shot Restorick. The headlines persisted. He wasn't. The Eastern Sniper Team, based around Drominty, was never identified and never arrested. When the second IRA ceasefire came in July 1997, 2 Barrett rifles remained unaccounted for. The capture of the Caraher cell removed the most active unit and its weapon from the field, but it didn't end the latent capability. The relief among British forces after the Freeduff arrests was real and documented. It was also partial. For 7 years, from the first Barrett shot on March 16, 1990, to the round that killed Stephen Restorick, the South Armagh sniper campaign demonstrated something the British military found genuinely difficult to acknowledge. A 4-man irregular cell had changed the behaviour of a professional army. Not through superior numbers, not through superior technology, through the sustained, patient application of one weapon in one specific terrain, operated by men who knew the ground in their bones and understood that disappearing mattered as much as aiming. The IRA's sniper campaign's results, in purely military terms, were modest. 9 kills over 7 years from what may have been 2 separate units. But the tactical effect was disproportionate. Checkpoint behaviour changed. Body armour budgets were rearranged. Patrol configurations were altered. The morale of soldiers who couldn't stand still without risk of a .50 caliber round created, in the British Army's own language, disciplinary problems. The South Armagh Brigade achieved, through the sniper campaign, what it had achieved with culvert bombs a decade earlier. It altered how the British Army operated. The SAS response to this didn't come from a louder version of conventional tactics. It came from accepting that conventional tactics weren't the answer, and building an entirely different approach from the ground up. Technical surveillance, patient intelligence development, a tracking device placed on a car that drove those roads for months while operators waited for the right moment. Intelligence company ran the surveillance. The SAS was the arrest force when the moment came. What Caraher and his team had built, a mobile firing platform, a community intelligence shield, a border sanctuary, a weapon that defeated Armagh, was defeated not by firepower, but by the one thing the sniper's methodology couldn't accommodate. He could evade patrols. He could evade ambushes. He could evade reactive helicopter response. What he couldn't evade was a tracking device attached to his car and weeks of silent, patient observation by people he never saw. The IRA turned South Armagh into a fortress where conventional soldiers couldn't safely walk the roads. In doing so, they created the conditions for a different kind of hunt. Michael Caraher became the most effective predator in his territory, which made him the highest priority target for something more patient, more methodical, and fundamentally quieter than anything the brigade had faced before. The SAS didn't beat the sniper by being louder. They beat him by being quieter. Subscribe for more stories like this.